Last time we spoke about the Battle of Beijing. General Gasly and the Eight-Nation Alliance began a grand march upon Beijing. They fought numerous battles at places like Beijing and Yangcun, utterly routing the Qing and Boxer forces. The road to Beijing was laid bare open to them, lest it not be for the extreme summer heat which took many lives. The Russians attempted to outrace everyone else to Beijing, but quickly bit off more than they could chew. Ultimately, the British were the first ones to enter the foreign legations. The besieged foreigners in the legations had been met with a last-ditch effort by the Qing to overrun them, but they held on for dear life. Now Beijing was being occupied by the Eight-Nation Alliance. What was to become of the Qing officials, of Empress Dowager Cixi? How would justice be served? This episode is The Boxer Rebellion Part 7, The Boxer Protocol. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Maybe you want a bit more of a visual experience? Over there I have an episode on the Boxer Rebellion, using a lot of footage from some rather unique films. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there I have exclusive podcasts, and this month's is on Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. Usually, you would assume the story was one and done. The Eight-Nation Alliance was flooding into Beijing. As they say, the cavalry had arrived. But it was not over. The next day of August the 15th saw more violence. The French deployed 4 artillery pieces onto the Tartar Wall and began bombarding the pink walls of the Imperial City. Meanwhile, General Cixi was mounting an assault upon the Imperial City alongside the American forces, who were battering their way through a series of courtyards trying to get to the Imperial City's southern gate. Their ultimate objective was the Forbidden City. When it seemed they were within reach of the Forbidden City, suddenly General Cixi commanded a withdrawal. The commanders had been arguing at a conference, and they all agreed that the Eight-Nation Alliance should take a more conciliatory approach towards the Qing government. Everyone was wondering whether the Emperor, or Empress Dowager Cixi, remained within the Forbidden City. If there was to be any conciliation at all, well, they were needed. Rumors began to emerge, stating that the Empress Dowager was still in the city, and that she would most likely commit suicide rather than be taken prisoner. Lennox Simpson was trying to investigate the situation, riding up to the Imperial City where he discovered a terrified eunuch huddled in a Qing guardhouse in the outer wall. He asked the eunuch how many forces guarded the Forbidden City, and the whereabouts of the Emperor and Empress Dowager. The eunuch blurted out, "The Emperor and the Empress Dowager, and indeed the whole court, have disappeared. They have fled. They're gone." There are countless tales of how it occurred, the dramatic flight of the Qing court. It is most likely that the decision to flee Beijing came about in the early hours of August 15th. One account given by the magistrate, Wu Yong, claimed he helped the Empress Dowager flee. Cixi was disguised in dark blue clothes of a Chinese peasant woman, and they even clipped her nails. Go Google a picture of Cixi. Imagine clipping those things. Allegedly, Cixi told Wu Yong, as she was hastily grabbing her personal belongings, "Who would have thought it would come to this?" Of the things that she grabbed, one was a precious bloodstone that she believed protected her through all dangers. She boarded one of 3 wooden carts and Cixi forcefully grabbed the emperor, not allowing him to be taken as a hostage, alongside her niece and the heir apparent. The imperial concubines were forbidden to accompany them, and they made a tearful farewell. It is said Emperor Guangxu's favorite concubine begged the emperor to take her with them, prompting Cixi, who hated the girl, to demand that she be tossed down a well. Apparently, the eunuchs rolled the poor girl up in a carpet and literally tossed her down a well in front of Emperor Guangxu, which is pretty hardcore, to be honest. Another account has it that Cixi tricked the girl by telling her, "We will all stay where we are, but we cannot allow ourselves to be taken alive by Western barbarians. There is only one way out for you and me. We must both die. It is easy. You go first. I promise I will follow you." Then the eunuchs tossed her in the well. There actually is another account that has it the eunuchs simply tossed the girl down the well after the imperial party departed because they just didn't like her. I can't help but picture Varys from Game of Thrones leading a bunch of eunuchs to get revenge on the royal family. Empress Dowager Cixi had fled the Imperial City once before, in fact 40 years prior during the Second Opium War. It was a pretty symbolic moment. Back then, she had apparently told the emperor to stay in the city lest the British and French raze Beijing to the ground. This time, she did the very opposite. On August 10th, Cixi had made an imperial decree ordering General Zheng Yu and some other Qing officials to remain in Beijing and maintain the government in exile. The royal party fled through roads filled with others trying to flee the city. Their eunuch planners assumed they would buy provisions along the way, but when they entered the countryside, they found it completely devastated. On August 17th, the royal party made it to the small town of Hualai, north of Beijing. The Boxers and disaffected troops had devastated the town so much, there was only a bowl of millet and green bean porridge to serve the Empress Dowager. Apparently to this, she said to her host, "In time of distress, this is enough. Can I at this time say what is good and what is not good?" From Hualai, they traveled to Kaogan and Taodong, near the Mongolian plateau, before they turned towards Taiyuan. Now, being so far from Beijing, they felt safer and thus, instead of conducting themselves under the guise of peasants, they now openly shown themselves and told people they were performing an official tour of inspection. It is said by Wu Yong, the Empress Dowager enjoyed talking to him and told him, "Talk as you please," as she herself took a large interest in talking to locals and visiting temples and attractions. Wu Yong theorized she had been cooped up for so long in the Imperial City, the outside world simply fascinated her. The mule litters were replaced with sedan chairs. Cixi began wearing luxurious Manchu garb and regrew her fingernails, which looked gross. Please go Google those pictures. Soon the royal party were issuing edicts and receiving reports on the situation of the Qing court in Beijing. Countless governors, viceroys, and other Qing officials flocked to pay respects and tribute to the royal party. They stayed in Taiyuan for 3 weeks at the home of Yu Xiang, where he boasted to Cixi how many foreigners he had executed. However, the Taiyuan massacre meant the foreigners might come to the city looking for revenge, so the royal party continued southwest towards Xi'an, the old capital of the Qing Dynasty. This, of course, was the territory held by General Dong Fuxiang, whose troops were the primary ones escorting the royal party. It was under General Dong Fuxiang's protection that the royal family now hunkered down for winter. It is said during this time, Guangxu's nephew began drawing pictures of demons and would often sketch a large tortoise with the name Yuan Shikai on its back. You see, the tortoise was a symbol of homosexuality, thus it was an insult to Yuan Shikai, who had been seen as the enemy who betrayed Guangxu. It is also said Guangxu took the pictures, hung them up on walls, and fired crossbows at them. Personally, this story sounds to me like an author giving a bit of foreshadowing flavor for Yuan Shikai, who would perform even greater betrayals later on. I am not going to lie, I have written quite a lot about Yuan Shikai. He's become something like a little meme on my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. By this point, I've covered the history of 1830 to about 1932, and its focus is basically on Chinese-Japanese history. Yuan Shikai is a behemoth when it comes to the formation of modern-day China, and honestly, his story is interesting to say the least. If you ever want to jump into the future to see what's going to happen in this series, well, you can always jump over to my personal channel and check out things like the Xinhai Revolution or China's warlord era episodes. There's so many of those, I made a full documentary. Now, back over in Beijing, news of the flight of the Qing court was not met with surprise by the foreigners. But now the foreigners were uncertain as to what they should be doing next. For some, it was a bit reminiscent of Napoleon's arrival to a deserted Moscow. Without the highest-ranking Qing officials around, what could they do? Meanwhile, one place was still under threat. That was Beijing. Over at the Beijing Cathedral, the foreigners had been fighting for their lives the entire time. When news emerged that the foreign legations had been rescued, everyone in the cathedral at Beijing rejoiced, awaiting their own rescue. The cathedral was the only Christian building within the Imperial City that was able to hold on and defend itself. It was an absolute miracle they managed to do so. The commander of 30 French Marines sent by Peasant on June the 1st to help out at Beijing was Lieutenant Paul-Henri. At the age of just 23, Bishop Favier had this to say of his conduct. He was as pious as he was brave, a true Breton. Henri had been given an impossible task, to defend an area with around 1,400 yards of wall, 12 to 15 feet high with a tiny amount of troops. Henri had men dig trenches, erect parapets, and use the cathedral as a last stronghold if it were to be overrun. The first week of June saw fires erupt throughout the capital, and gunfire could be heard everywhere. Bishop Favier looked from the top of the cathedral to see on the 13th and the 14th churches and cathedrals in Beijing being razed to the ground. Refugees poured into Beijing's cathedral more and more, and on the 15th a group of Catholic sisters and children were running from Boxers to the cathedral, with Favier giving this account of the scene. Their leader on a horse is a lama, or a priest. He precedes an immense red flag, surrounded by young Boxers who have undergone the incantations and are likewise dressed in red. They burned perfumed sticks, prostrating themselves on entering our street to the south, and then advanced in compact bands. The French Marines allowed them to reach 200 yards from the barricades before unleashing a volley, wounding 50 and sending the rest fleeing. By June the 18th, Henri worried about enemy artillery, and he tried to fortify the defenses more so. On the 20th, news of von Kettele's death came. Pichon sent a message to Favier that there was no hope of fleeing Beijing. 3,420 people, two-thirds of which were women and children, were trapped at Beijing. Their defenses were comically small, 30 French and a dozen Italian Marines, whose commander was Lieutenant Olivieri, aged 25. The able-bodied Chinese Christians volunteered to bolster the forces, making spears, brandishing some knives, and a few were given rifles by the Marines. June the 22nd saw Krupp guns firing upon Beijing, shattering windows and sending bricks flying everywhere. The main gate at Beijing was being battered by shells. Lieutenant Henri led a sortie of 4 Marines and 30 Chinese Christians to seize the artillery piece hitting the main gate. They managed to seize it, losing 2 Chinese in the process. The next day simply saw more artillery bombardment. By the 26th, all the buildings near Beijing were ablaze, and Boxers were seen erecting ladders and scaffoldings against the walls. The defenders were getting pot shots every day. On the 27th, Henri's second-in-command, Jean-Nic, was shot in the shoulder and would die 3 days later. By July the 1st, the defenders of Beijing began to eat mule and horse as they ran out of vegetables. Smallpox broke out amongst the children. By July the 3rd, 15 were dying per day. The French Marines began making scarecrows to help against snipers. It turned out watchmakers amongst the Chinese Christians were capable of creating cartridges for Mausers and other guns. The defenders were able to manufacture powder for cannons, with things that they had seized from the surrounding enemy during the sorties. The men fired only 100 rounds per day. Henri noted on July the 5th, 13 rounds was only fired. On the 14th, it was 74. Famine was more threatening than the lack of ammunition. On July the 6th, Henri checked rations and estimated they could hold out for perhaps 20 more days. The Boxers began manufacturing exploding missiles that they lobbed at the Cathedral. These were a sort of fire pot, a container carrying around 3 pounds of gunpowder with long fuses. On a single day, the Boxers tossed more than 250 of these, but the defenders ingeniously put buckets, casks, and even bathtubs full of water everywhere to fight the emerging fires. The Qing artillery smashed the cathedral's clock tower and walls without any mercy. On July the 18th, the defenders were countermining when a mine exploded, killing 25 and injuring 28. One French Marine described the carnage as such: "Where bits of waste meat were being dragged out, fragments of flesh and severed limbs were spattered about, and part of someone's chest was smashed against a wall." Qing troops atop the Imperial City walls fired down upon the defenders at all times. By July the 28th, rations were a meager 8 ounces of food per day. On July the 30th, the Qing assaulted the north wall, setting the cathedral roofs on fire. Henri tried to rally the men, and he took a bullet in the neck and another into his side. Henri died in the arms of a priest 20 minutes later, and he was buried beneath a statue of Our Lady of Lourdes in the cathedral garden. Lieutenant Olivieri took command after his death. The Qing and Boxers seemed emboldened and began firing arrows with messages to the Chinese Christians urging them to abandon the foreigners and to return to the old ways. "You Christians, shut up in the Beijing, reduced to the greatest misery, eating leaves of trees. Why do you resist? We have leveled cannon and set mines against you, and you will be destroyed in a short time. You have been deceived by the devils of Europe. Return to the ancient religion. Deliver up Bishop Favier and the others, and you will have saved your lives, and we will give you stuff to eat. If you do not do so, you, your wives and children, will all be cut up into pieces." It is said the Boxers believed Bishop Favier was a demon who was using an invulnerability spell by smearing menstrual blood over his face and nailing naked women and dead fetuses to the cathedral walls. They also believed the foreigners possessed a weapon called the 10,000 Women Flag, woven from female pubic hair, which stole the power from the Boxer gods. Gotta hand it to their imagination. Despite the messages, the Chinese Christians stayed put. By August the 2nd, the besieged were starving. They began trying to capture stray dogs to eat. On August the 5th, Favier wrote this: "We can resist balls, bullets, and bombs, but there is no defense against famine." On August the 10th, 400 pounds of rice and mule were all that remained. Favier was forced to send Christian Chinese out in desperation to try and reach the foreign legation for some help. Many were flayed, beheaded, and put on spikes near Beijing. On August the 12th, a violent explosion shook Beijing. A giant mine had gone off, causing a crater 7 yards deep and 40 yards wide. It buried 5 Italian Marines, with Olivieri and 80 Chinese. Olivieri recounted being saved from the burial. "They succeeded in uncovering one of my hands, and finding it still warm, redoubled their efforts until my whole body was free." However, his men were mutilated and dying. The mine had caused a large breach in the wall, and the enemy could easily have stormed Beijing, but they didn't. Another mine went off the following day, but the enemy did not storm Beijing. Just when it seemed that they were all going to die on August the 14th, the defenders heard Boxers scream out, "The devils from Europe are approaching." The Boxers were also screaming at the defenders of Beijing that they would all be massacred before the rescuers got to them. But Olivieri and the defenders watched as Qing banners were lowered from walls. Qing soldiers and Boxers were beginning to flee. By 5 p.m., they saw Europeans on the walls waving an American flag. The defenders waited for the rescue on August 15th, but no one came. Olivieri worried the relief force had been repelled. Then suddenly Japanese troops climbed over the walls and stormed into Beijing. Olivieri rushed over shouting, "We are saved!" The other members of the Eight-Nation Alliance were rather shocked by the actions of the Japanese. Beijing was a French responsibility. The French force that entered Beijing, however, was too small to fight their way over to Beijing. As General Frey noted, "What was our surprise to see ahead of us between 250 to 300 Japanese, whose presence nobody could explain. The Japanese, without any fuss, simply did the deed on their own merit." Beijing saw 400 people, including 166 children, die during the siege. Unlike the fight for the legations, Beijing never had a single day of rest. There was no truce for Beijing. The defenders fought every single day. As Favier assessed the damage in Beijing, he had this to say: "In Peking, 3 churches, 7 large chapels, the colleges, hospitals, all are destroyed. The Beijing, damaged by shells, is the only building undestroyed. In short, the ruin is almost entire. The work of 40 years is nearly annihilated. The courage of missionaries, nevertheless, is not of the wane. We shall begin over again." As Bishop Favier wandered around Beijing, he estimated perhaps 30,000 Catholics had been killed. News emerged that 204 nuns, priests, missionaries, and their family members had been murdered. Half of the population of Beijing had fled in terror as the foreign armies flooded in. Many Qing officials committed suicide. Many Chinese women with bound feet likewise did so. The special correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, Dr. E.J. Dillon, wrote, "Chinese women honestly believe that no more terrible fate could overtake them than to fall alive into the hands of Europeans and Christians. It is to be feared that they were right." Dr. Dillon personally saw the corpses of women who had been raped and bayoneted to death. Luella Minor, within the foreign legation, had this to say on the matter: "The conduct of the Russian soldiers is atrocious. The French are not much better, and the Japanese are looting and burning without mercy. Women and girls by hundreds have committed suicide to escape a worse fate at the hands of the Russians and Japanese brutes. Our American soldiers saw them jumping into the rivers and into wells in Dongqiao. 12 girls in one well, and one mother was drowning 2 of her little children in a large water jar." Roger Keyes added his own account. "Every Chinaman was treated as a boxer by the Russian and French troops, and the slaughter of men, women, and children in retaliation was revolting." A British officer, Major Look, told Keyes that, quote, "He had never seen anything more horrible, and some of his young Marines were literally sick." Lennox Simpson stated that the British Indian forces molested female Chinese Christians until they were flogged by some foreign women. It is said the Japanese had planned ahead of time for the situation. According to Roger Keyes, "Their government had wisely taken the precaution of sending their regimental wives with them, and they were established in houses at Tianjin and Peking directly for the troops that settled down." The first days of the occupation saw indiscriminate looting and rape by all the nationalities. The Allied commander-in-chief, von Waldesee, who only arrived in late September, would write this: "Every nationality accords the palm to some other in respect to the art of plundering, but it remains the fact that each and all of them went in hot and strong for plunder." On August the 18th, all the diplomats and military commanders met at the Russian legation to discuss how to go about getting some reprisals against the Qing. The Germans argued for severe punishment because of von Kettler's murder. They wanted a punitive expedition and to raise the Imperial City. The Russians favored a more conciliatory line in northern China. But of course, something I have not talked about was going on over there. The Russians had basically already invaded Manchuria. One thing they all agreed upon was an enormous victory parade through the Imperial City, a grand humiliation. Each nation scrambled to be the first in the parade. The Russians argued that they had the largest force, which was a lie. It was the Japanese. There are countless photographs of the foreign armies in the city and of the parade. But to give a brief description, on August 28th, George Morrison stated this: "The appearance of French troops complaining that there was every excuse for their uniforms to be dirty, but that the faces of many of the men should be so too, was quite inexcusable. The French looked singularly decadent in blue dungarees, and that their commander, General Frey, was small and pot-bellied. The Cossacks were heavy and rough, but the Germans, they looked splendid, and the Japanese officers very smart. The British, by contrast, looked rather ragtag and bobtail. The dignity of the occasion was further undermined by the ineptitude of the Russian band, which could not keep pace with 8 successive national anthems and found itself blasting out the Marseillaise as the Italians marched past the saluting base. An army of eunuchs escorted by Qing officials brought the foreigners into the Forbidden City, which saw some looting. Indeed, the looting of the capital of China by the Eight-Nation Alliance is probably one of the largest looting accounts in human history. One of the sources I am using has an entire chapter dedicated to only story accounts of what was stolen by whom, but it's simply too much to delve into. Many museums today have stolen items from this event. Within 24 hours of taking the city, not a trace of Boxers existed. There was a wild Boxer hunt that saw much horror. Daily executions occurred, as described to us by George Morrison. The execution and the long drawn-out neck. The butcher with his apron. The executioner tearing open his long coat. The grunt as he brought down the knife. The dogs lapping up the blood. The closeness of the head to the ground, the face nearly touching. Apparently the Germans got their prisoners to dig their own trench before being shot in the back of the head. During September, the Allies were awaiting the arrival of von Waldesee, but a number of military operations were mounted against Boxer strongholds in the Beijing area. Von Waldesee arrived to Beijing in October, assuming command and established his HQ in Cixi's palace, in the Forbidden City. Von Waldesee decided punitive expeditions needed to be increased, and Germany began taking the lead in several dozen. The countryside was butchered in a wild hunt for Boxers. Civilians, Qing soldiers, Qing officials, just about anyone faced numerous foreign troops who killed or abused them. Von Waldesee faced a more daunting task, however: peace negotiations. There was a mutual distrust amongst the nations, and conflicts broke out often. Li Hangzhang, poor old Li Hangzhang, and Prince Ching were appointed the imperial plenipotentiary powers. They only arrived in Beijing in October. The first meeting was held on Christmas Eve between them and the foreign ministers. Li Hangzhang was not present due to illness. The foreign ministers questioned whether the Qing plenipotentiaries were even real agents of the emperor or that of the Qing government in exile. Prince Ching managed to convince them he did hold authority. The Allies pondered if the dynasty should change, but it was quickly apparent the Manchu would never allow for such a thing to occur. All the ministers agreed the Manchu dynasty should remain on the throne. Then they all pondered what kind of punishment should be donned out for the guilty. Then they pondered punishment of the guilty, and a large indemnity payment on behalf of the Qing dynasty. The indemnity fee first brought up was $67.5 million, roughly 4.3 so in billions of dollars today. The Americans argued it was far too high and would bankrupt China. American Secretary of State John Hay sent a telegram to the great powers stating, "America's policy was to bring permanent safety and peace to China and to preserve China's territorial integrity." Von Waldesee would go on the record to say, "The United States, it seems, to desire that nobody shall get anything out of China." However, on May the 26th, an imperial edict announced that the indemnity payment would be $67,500,000, to be paid in full over the course of 39 years. The sum was to be distributed as follows: Russia 28.97%, Germany 20.02%, France 15.75%, Britain 11.25%, Japan 7.73%, United States 7.32%, Italy 7.32%, Belgium 1.89%, Austro-Hungary 0.89%, the Netherlands 0.17%, Spain 0.03%, Portugal 0.021%, Sweden and Norway at 0.014%. The payment, by the way, would be amortized on December the 31st of 1940. Now, the negotiations for punishments were a lot more complicated. The Allies first wanted to see the executions of prominent pro-Boxer officials, which Empress Dowager Cixi wanted to avoid. Cixi made many counter-proposals, but eventually was forced to hand over some officials. Yu Xiang, the mastermind behind the Tiyuan massacre, was reportedly executed, though notably there is a myth he simply went into exile. Qing official Ying Nian strangled himself. Some other officials apparently were killed by having their mouths and nostrils stuffed with rice paper by eunuchs, which is a pretty weird one, I must say, and many others were poisoned. Prince Tuan and his brother escaped the death penalty, and they were exiled to Turkestan. Dong Fusang was too powerful to kill, much to the dismay of the foreigners. Indeed, his Muslim army in the northwest was the bulwark at the time. All he suffered was a demotion, but in reality, he was now a major leading figure. Over 100 Qing officials were executed or exiled in the end. A peace treaty containing 12 articles was signed in the Spanish legation on September the 7th of 1901, known as the Boxer Protocol. The Qing were prohibited from importing arms and ammunition for 2 years. The Daku forts were ordered to be destroyed. The legation quarters would receive special status. Boxers and Qing officials who had supported them would face justice. The Zhongyamen was replaced with a foreign office. The Qing government was to prohibit under the pain of death any membership for anti-foreign societies. Civil examinations were suspended for 5 years in any area that saw violence against foreigners. The Emperor Guangxu was to apologize to Kaiser Wilhelm for the murder of Baron von Ketteler. Emperor Guangxu was to appoint Naizong as a special envoy to be sent to apologize to Emperor Meiji for the murder of Mr. Sugiyama. The Qing government was to erect a commemorative arch over the spot where Baron von Ketteler was killed. And at last, the great powers would be allowed to occupy numerous important cities so much as to make sure that their legations were protected. Empress Dowager Cixi was surprised by the terms of the treaty, and that she was not punished personally. Hell, China was not required to surrender any more territory. Some members of her court argued China should continue the war and that the 8-nation alliance could not hope to face the interior of China. Some argued if Dong Fusang were allowed to raise his force to about 50,000 men, he could dislodge the foreign encroachment. Cixi, however, was as much a pragmatist as she was a conservative in her ways. If the allied nations would allow Emperor Guangxu and her to return to Beijing, retaining their honor, she believed she had little to lose. She also was not a moron, and understood exactly why the Boxer Protocol was made in the way it was. The great powers wanted to receive payments, and in order to do so, they needed the Manchu to sit on the dragon throne. She ordered Li Hangjiang to do all he could to reestablish relations with the foreign governments. She also ordered any decrees she made praising the Boxers to be expunged from the official records, and secretly ordered all blame to be placed on Emperor Guangxu. She gave posthumous honors to all the progressive Qing officials that she had beheaded during the siege, and disinherited the heir apparent son of Prince Duan, whom apparently she did not like very much. An imperial decree in the name of Emperor Guangxu announced, "Our sacred mother's advanced age renders it necessary that we should take the greatest care of her health, so that she may attain to peaceful longevity. A long journey in the heat being evidently undesirable, we have fixed on the 19th day of the 7th moon to commence our return journey and are now preparing to escort Her Majesty. The return to Beijing should be held as one of the greatest feats of public relations exercises in history, second only to Robert Downey Jr. The 700-mile journey began in October of 1901, seeing the imperial family carried in yellow sedan chairs, sparing no expense. George Morrison details it quite well. Along the frost-bound, uneven tracks which serves for roads in northern China, an unending stream of laden wagons croaked and groaned through the short winter's day and on, guided by soldier torch-bearers, through bitter nights to the appointed stopping places. But for the Empress Dowager and the Emperor, there was easy journeying, and a way literally made smooth. Throughout its entire distance, the road over which the imperial palanquins were carried had been converted into a smooth, even surface of shining clay, soft and noiseless underfoot. Not only had every stone been removed, but as the procession approached, gangs of men were employed in the brushing of the surface with feather brooms. At intervals of about 10 miles, well-appointed rest houses had been built. The cost of this King's Highway, quite useless, of course, for the ordinary traffic of the country, was stated by a native contractor to amount to 50 Mexican dollars for every 8 yards, say around 1,000 pounds per mile, the clay having to be carried in some places from a great distance. As an example of the lavish expenditure of the court and its officials in the land where squalor is a pervading feature, this is quite typical. The Empress Dowager crossed the Yellow River in a gilded, lacquered, dragon-shaped barge, after offering wine and incense to the river god. Believe it or not, the last part of the journey was done by train, and the Empress Dowager Cixi looked excited to be in what she called an iron centipede. Everyone in Beijing was given an imperial decree to graciously permit them to watch the royal family return to the imperial court. We are told, as Cixi got out of her chair, the Empress glanced up at the smoke-blackened walls and saw us, a row of foreigners, and, looking up at us, lifted her closed hands under her chin and made a series of little bows. Cixi was a lover of theatricals, and she made sure it was a hell of a show. Within days, foreign ministers were summoned to present themselves to the emperor and for the first time officially enter the Forbidden City. On February the 1st, Cixi invited the ladies of the diplomats to her. The foreign community nor Cixi could know it, but the Boxer Rebellion was to be one of the last nails in a coffin made for the Qing Dynasty. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to get a bit of a tease as to what's going to happen in the future of this series? Check out my episode on the Xinhan Revolution. Also, please check out my Patreon over at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. This month's exclusive podcast over there is on Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. And so the Boxer Rebellion, excluding some events in Manchuria, was all but over. The Boxer Protocol ushered in a brand new Qing dynasty that surely would survive the test of time and not succumb to an agonizing death, as the people of China could take it no longer.